My name is Claire Bennett, and I used to believe that love could survive anything, even pride. I was wrong. The last thing my husband ever said to me was, "Without me, you wouldn't last a single day." That sentence, that arrogance cut through me, deeper than any betrayal could, because he meant it, and because for years I almost believed him. We were the Bennetts of Fairfield, Connecticut, the couple who had everything. A lakefront home matching Mercedes Christmas cards and white cashmere. People used to whisper about how perfect we were. What they didn't see was the silence inside those walls. Silence polished like marble. Silence that kept me small. In the beginning, I wasn't a trophy. I was his partner. We built his company together late nights, spreadsheets, stale coffee. I was the numbers, he was the charm. And when success finally came, he began to forget who'd held the flashlight when he couldn't see his own path. The first time he raised his voice wasn't anger, it was correction. "Don't embarrass me, Claire. You don't understand how these things work." The second time, it was instruction. The third time, it was habit. And then it never stopped. He liked to call it discipline. I called it erasure. He'd walk into a room and everyone would adjust their tone, their smile, their stance. Even me. Especially me. That's how power works when you let it. It doesn't roar, it rearranges the air. At charity dinners, he'd place a hand on my back, not affection, but ownership. "Claire dear," he'd say, with a grin to the board, "she doesn't get into the numbers, that's my job." I'd nod and smile the way women of my generation were taught to, politely, gracefully, invisibly. Our 20th anniversary fell on the same night as his company's gala. The ballroom was lit like a cathedral, champagne towers, silver linens, everyone dressed like money. I stood beside him, wearing the pearl necklace his mother once wore. It was supposed to symbolize legacy. To me, it felt like a leash. When the speeches began, he took the microphone. His voice filled the room, warm, confident, practiced. He thanked the team, his mentors, his family. Then, with that grin that made investors open checkbooks, he turned to me. And of course, he said to my lovely wife, who's never had to lift a finger, "Without me, she wouldn't last a single day." The room erupted in laughter. Glasses clinked. I smiled the smile of a woman who'd mastered survival through silence. Inside, something shifted. Not rage, not heartbreak. Something colder, something final. When we got home, he poured another drink and congratulated himself for being witty. I walked upstairs, removed my pearls, and stared at my reflection. I didn't look broken. I looked empty. Like a woman who had finally run out of reasons to explain herself. That night I made tea instead of crying. I sat at the kitchen island, the same marble slab we'd chosen together, back when we were still equals, and wrote one line on a piece of stationery. "Thank you for showing me what I'm worth." I folded it neatly, left it beside his favorite scotch, and walked into my office. The USB drive sat in a drawer, right where I'd hidden it years ago. Not as a weapon, as insurance. Every file, every contract, every hidden account, all things he'd asked me to handle, because you're good with details, honey. At dawn, the lake outside shimmered like glass. I packed a small suitcase, slipped the USB into my pocket, and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet pine and morning dew. Freedom has no sound, only stillness. As I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel victorious. I felt quiet, and sometimes quiet is the loudest way to leave. The first morning away from him didn't feel like freedom. It felt like standing in a room where the clock had stopped. I checked my phone, dozens of missed calls from friends, none from him. I imagined him pacing that perfect kitchen, furious that I hadn't come crawling back yet. For the first time in years, the thought didn't scare me. It almost made me smile. I drove south until the houses thinned, and the billboards started advertising divorce lawyers and used cars. I ended up in a small town off I-95, the kind of place where nobody cares who you used to be. I paid cash for a room above a bakery. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Martha, gave me a key and a cinnamon roll. "You look like you need something warm," she said. I hadn't realized how cold I'd been. For 2 days, I didn't speak to anyone. I slept, I ate. I walked by the river that cut through town. My body was exhausted in ways I didn't understand. It wasn't just years of marriage. It was years of pretending to be smaller than I was. Every step away from Fairfield felt like oxygen returning to my lungs. On the third day, I opened my laptop. The wallpaper still showed a photo from the gala, him in his tuxedo, me smiling beside him. I deleted it. Then I plugged in the USB. The tiny light blinked once like an eye opening after a long sleep. Everything was there. Payroll accounts, wire transfers, tax shelters, in names I didn't recognize. He'd used my access, my credentials, my trust. I'd signed dozens of forms for him over the years. "Just paperwork, Claire," he'd said, sliding them across the table. But now the signatures told another story. I didn't plan to destroy him. I only wanted the truth to exist somewhere he couldn't bury it. So I encrypted the files, uploaded copies to cloud storage, and wrote a single line in a folder labeled Legacy. Control is an illusion. By the time I closed the laptop, my hands were steady. For the first time in decades, my heartbeat felt like my own. That evening, Martha joined me for coffee. She told me she'd left her husband 30 years ago, a preacher who believed God had granted him ownership of her. She said men like that don't crumble when you fight them. They crumble when you disappear. I stared at the steam rising from my cup and thought I already have. Meanwhile, in Fairfield, the silence began to echo. My sister called to tell me that my ex-husband I corrected, had shown up at her house demanding to know where I was. He wasn't angry yet. He was confident. "She'll come back when she runs out of money," he'd told her. I almost laughed. Money had always been his language. He assumed I couldn't speak it without him, but every transaction, every password, every bank authorization. I'd built the system that kept his empire breathing. I knew exactly where its lungs were. That night I sat by the window and watched the neon sign from the bakery flicker on and off. Fairfield felt like another planet. The lake, the mansion, the pearl necklace, all props in a story I no longer believed in. Somewhere he was drinking scotch and rehearsing anger for when I returned. He didn't understand that I wasn't playing anymore. Before bed, I wrote in my journal, "He built a cage, but I designed the lock." Sleep came easily. For the first time, dreams didn't replay arguments. They replayed quiet, the sound of wind through pine trees, of car tires, on wet asphalt, of distance growing. When morning came, I walked to the post office and mailed a small package addressed to Bennett Holdings' legal department. Inside was a single flash drive, not the one I carried, but a duplicate. It contained enough discrepancies to trigger an audit, nothing more. I didn't need to expose everything at once. The truth, like rot, spreads better when left unseen for a while. As I dropped the envelope into the slot, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from him. His voice was calm, practiced. "Claire, whatever game you think you're playing, end it. You don't want to embarrass yourself." He still didn't get it. I wasn't embarrassed. I was gone. I walked out of the post office and looked up at the autumn sky, crisp, cloudless, almost cruel in its beauty. Somewhere behind me, a door had closed, and for once I didn't reach to hold it open. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't come with trumpets or applause. It's a quiet cup of coffee in a rented room, a woman breathing evenly for the first time in years, and a small silver USB drive resting beside her hand. The next move wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was preparation. He didn't notice she was gone until the coffee pot was cold. That's how certain he was of his own importance. To him, I was routine like filtered air or background music, always there, never questioned. He probably thought I was in the garden or at yoga or sulking upstairs. But as the hours passed, I imagined the first flicker of unease settling into his chest. Because for the first time in our 23 years of marriage, he couldn't find me. I know all this because I could almost feel at that moment of confusion before pride curdled into anger. He'd walk from room to room calling my name, not out of love, but habit. He'd glance at the note beside the scotch bottle, the one that said, "Thank you for showing me what I'm worth." He'd read it twice, maybe 3 times, then crumple it in his fist. I could see it as clearly as if I were there. By noon, his assistant Julia would have noticed that the password to the main payroll server wasn't working. By 2, the finance department would call him in a panic, accounts locked pending transactions bouncing back. At 3, the bank manager would leave him a polite voicemail. "Mr. Bennett, there seems to be an authorization mismatch on your corporate account. Could you please confirm your secondary signature?" He'd call Julia, his voice tightening with each unanswered question. Who changed the access keys? Who signed off on this? Julia would check the logs, see my initials, C. Bennett, primary. The system would show that I still had authorization privileges. It wouldn't make sense to him because he'd told the IT team to remove me last year, but he never followed up. He never does. By the time evening came, I imagine he poured himself another drink, pacing the living room like a man who's misplaced his reflection. The control he worshipped was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know why. He'd call a lawyer, demand an explanation, maybe even threaten to sue. But lawyers move slowly when they smell smoke, and by then, the fire had already started. Meanwhile, I sat on the edge of a motel bed 2 towns away, watching the local news flicker across a tiny TV. The headline, Bennett Holdings, temporarily suspends trading amid technical issues. The anchor's tone was neutral, but the word temporarily lingered like a question. I stirred my coffee and waited for the next part of the broadcast. Nothing else came. The story would grow on its own. It always does. The next morning, my sister called again. She didn't ask where I was. She just whispered, "He's losing it, Claire." Apparently, he'd shown up at the office before sunrise, shouting orders no one could follow. The boardroom lights stayed on all day. He made promises, threats, anything to keep control. But the one person who understood how his empire actually functioned wasn't there anymore. It's strange how fragile power is. You spend decades building it, layering it with charm and status and fear, and it only takes one missing link to collapse the whole structure. For him, that link was me. I had been the quiet center of gravity, the person who remembered birthdays, reconciled accounts, kept the right people from quitting. He'd mistaken that for servitude. By noon, investors started calling the house. His father, old Mr. Bennett, left a message that would have made me pity him if I hadn't already learned better. "What did you do, son?" "The board's in chaos." "You fix this, you hear me." He couldn't. When panic sets in, proud men don't reflect, they react. He hired a private investigator to find me convinced I'd stolen something. Technically, I had. I'd stolen his certainty. He must have called everyone we knew, our friends from the club, his golfing buddies, even the pastor who married us. They'd all say the same thing. "She's probably just upset." And that would infuriate him even more because it implied I had emotions beyond the ones he approved of. That night, his world shrank. The mansion, once full of people, grew hollow. The staff avoided him. His phone buzzed nonstop, reporters, lawyers, partners, all demanding explanations he couldn't give. Somewhere between rage and exhaustion, he'd pour himself another glass and replay every conversation, every hint he'd ignored. Maybe he'd remember how often I asked, "Do you ever read what you sign?" Maybe he'd laugh bitterly when he realized that I wasn't asking for his protection. I was warning him. And me, I slept better than I had in years. Not out of triumph, but release. For so long, I'd been the glue holding together a man who mistook me for wallpaper. When I left, the cracks didn't appear. They'd been there all along. They just finally had room to spread. Sometimes revenge doesn't need planning. Sometimes all it needs is absence, the vacuum left when the person you underestimated stops holding you up. By the end of that second day, the headlines changed federal inquiry into Bennett Holdings' financial irregularities. He must have felt the chill of inevitability then. I can almost hear the ice clinking in his glass. He'd whisper to the empty room, maybe to convince himself she'll come back. She always does. But not this time. By Thursday morning, Fairfield was buzzing with rumors. In a town where people read the business section before the Bible scandal travels faster than faith, Bennett Holdings, his golden empire, was unraveling in real time. The local paper used words like internal discrepancies and temporary suspension, but everyone knew what that meant. Someone had pulled the wrong thread, and the whole suit was coming apart. I sat in the corner of a coffee shop 2 towns over, stirring honey into my cup, pretending not to notice the businessmen whispering at the next table. They spoke his name like it was both a warning and a prayer. He must have been drowning in phone calls. Lawyers, investors, auditors. The same people who once toasted him were now demanding explanations. Every contract, every account, every "trust me, I'll handle it" deal suddenly exposed under fluorescent light. And every path led back to one thing: my signature. He told people for years that I didn't understand business, that I was just a wife with a good memory for birthdays and balance sheets. He didn't realize that those balance sheets were his lifeline, and mine were the hands that kept them straight. On the third day, the board convened an emergency meeting. I imagine the tension in that mahogany room, the smell of stale coffee and fear. His voice would have been sharp, commanding, insisting that everything was under control. But the board wasn't listening anymore. They'd seen the numbers. They'd seen the missing transfers, the unfiled tax reports, the anonymous whistleblower email that had landed in their inboxes overnight. He'd demand to know who leaked it. He'd blame IT accounting, maybe even Julia. He'd never guess it came from me. I wasn't trying to destroy him. That would have been too easy. Destruction is loud, and he always thrived in noise. I wanted silence, the kind that makes powerful men look around a room and realize no one believes them anymore. By afternoon, the stock price began to slide. Small at first, like a heartbeat skipping a beat. Then faster. Investors panicked. Reporters camped outside the corporate offices. Employees whispered in hallways, afraid to log into their emails. The chaos spread the way mold does, slowly at first, then everywhere at once. That evening, he called my sister again. His tone had changed. Gone was the command, replaced by something closer to pleading. Tell her I just need to talk. That's all. My sister said she didn't know where I was. It wasn't a lie. I hadn't told her. At the motel, I sat cross-legged on the bed laptop, opened the glow casting pale light across the room. I watched the market reports scroll by, each red arrow, another piece of him slipping away. Martha knocked on the door, holding a slice of pie. You look like you're watching the weather, she said. I am, I replied. A storm I should have seen coming years ago. She didn't ask questions, just left the plate and a soft smile. Older women know better than to pry into another woman's quiet revenge. Meanwhile, the board of directors voted. A majority agreed to suspend him pending investigation. That same night, 2 senior partners resigned, citing ethical concerns. His father refused his calls. The housekeeper quit. Even the driver didn't show up the next morning. Power is loyal until it's inconvenient. He tried damage control, of course. Released a statement to the press about technical mismanagement and internal restructuring, but reporters are like wolves, they can smell weakness. The story spread beyond Fairfield. By Friday, national outlets were running the headline, Bennett Holdings under federal scrutiny. In another life, I might have felt sorry for him, but sorrow is for accidents. What he was facing wasn't an accident, it was the consequence of arrogance. I thought about the years he'd made me invisible. The dinners where I sat beside him smiling through jokes that made me the punchline. The deals where he'd dismiss my advice with a wave of his hand. You wouldn't understand, Claire. It's complicated. It wasn't complicated. It was theft disguised as confidence. He built a castle on sand, and I was the tide. Late that night, as he packed a bag to fly to New York for crisis meetings, the power went out in his house. A blown transformer, maybe. Or maybe it just felt poetic, his empire going dark, one switch at a time. I didn't call. I didn't need to. He was already hearing my silence everywhere he turned. In the unanswered emails, the frozen accounts, the whispers in corridors. For the first time, he was living in a world without me to hold it together. And for the first time, I didn't care how he survived it. At dawn, I closed my laptop. The news ticker kept looping his name like a prayer nobody wanted to answer. I reached for the USB on the nightstand and turned it over in my hand, the metal cool against my skin. It wasn't about the files anymore. It was about proof that I'd existed in his world, not as decoration, but as structure. And when the structure walked away, the roof caved in. I slept well that night. The chaos outside was just the sound of balance returning. By the 5th day, Fairfield had grown quieter, not peaceful quiet, but the uneasy hush that settles after an earthquake. The news cycle had moved from speculation to analysis, every pundit dissecting how a solid American company could collapse overnight. I didn't need to read between the lines to know they were circling him like vultures. He still hadn't found me. He never would not, because I'd hidden well, but because he'd never learned how to look for me. To him, I'd always been background, the hum of a refrigerator, the soft turning of gears that kept his world spinning. He didn't know what my absence would sound like. Now he did. I pictured the house. I knew its rhythms better than my own pulse. The morning news blaring too loud, the smell of burnt coffee, the faint echo of his shoes crossing the hardwood floor. But now that sound was swallowed by emptiness. Even the air conditioning would feel different too loud without someone to talk over it. Julia, his assistant, quit on Monday. She sent me a message from an anonymous email. I don't know what happened, but thank you. He made everyone miserable. You were the only thing that ever made that place human. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I deleted them. The past didn't need witnesses. Martha noticed I'd stopped coming down for breakfast. You look like someone waiting for the right kind of silence, she said one morning as she poured coffee into my cup. She was right. Silence has flavors. The one I was listening for now was the kind that hums with finality the moment when the dust truly settles. His father was hospitalized midweek. Stress, they said. The old man's blood pressure had spiked when the federal agents came asking questions. I didn't smile when I heard it. Some wounds cut deeper than satisfaction can reach. Every headline felt like an echo of that gala night. The laughter, the applause, the flashbulbs all gone, replaced by phrases like fraud investigation, negligence, imminent bankruptcy. Each word was another pearl falling from the necklace of his reputation. But what haunted him most wasn't the press or the numbers. It was the quiet, the absence of someone to buffer him from the consequences of his own cruelty. He was the kind of man who needed an audience, and suddenly the theater was empty. I imagined him sitting at that marble counter, the same place where I'd left my note, staring at the imprint of a ring that wasn't there anymore. Maybe he replayed that last conversation in his head, the scotch glass in his hand, my silence across the table. Maybe he realized too late that my silence had never been weakness. It had been measurement. People often assume revenge feels like fire blazing, furious consuming. But it doesn't. It feels like ice. Slow, certain, beautiful in its stillness. You don't rush it. You just let it freeze everything that once hurt you. Around day 7, a journalist emailed me. How she found my address, I'll never know. She said she wanted to tell my side of the story. The world loves a redemption arc, she wrote. But this wasn't redemption, it was revelation. And revelations don't need interviews, they need distance. I closed the email, unplugged the laptop, and went for a walk. The trees were shedding their leaves early that year. Each one fell with a soft whisper, a quiet surrender. The kind of beauty you only notice when no one's talking over it. At the diner that evening, the television above the counter played a business segment. His picture flashed briefly on screen, that confident, practiced smile he'd worn for years. The anchor's voice was clinical. Sources confirm the resignation of CEO Richard Bennett amid allegations of fiscal misconduct. Martha looked up from her crossword. That your husband, she asked. Was I said. She nodded once, then went back to her puzzle. No questions, just understanding. The kind women over 60 carry like a secret language. Later that night, alone in my rented room, I took out the USB. It caught the lamplight like a coin at the bottom of a wishing well. For years I'd thought it represented his power, the proof of everything he owned, everything he controlled. But as I turned it in my hand, I realized it was the opposite. It wasn't the symbol of what he had. It was the symbol of what I'd taken back choice. He had his empire, I had the truth, and between the two, only one could survive silence. In Fairfield, the mansion lights went dark. The neighbors whispered about foreclosure. The staff disappeared one by one. The Bennett estate, once a monument to control, was now just another empty house by the lake waiting for someone else's story. I didn't need to see it to know. Some ghosts don't haunt places, they haunt absences. And in that house, my absence was everywhere, in the quiet stove, the untouched piano, the dust gathering on the marble where my note once lay. He used to say I was the quiet type. He was right. I've just learned how loud quiet can be. The first time I saw his face on national television, he looked smaller. Not physically, pride doesn't shrink that fast, but in presence. The man who once commanded rooms with his voice now stared into cameras, eyes darting, lips pressed thin. The reporter said words like fraud, frozen assets, and pending investigation. I didn't flinch. I'd heard those words before, whispered in boardrooms when other men thought I wasn't listening. It was strange watching his downfall through the same screen that had once played our wedding video. 23 years ago, he'd smiled into that camera, promising forever. Now the same face was explaining how a few clerical oversights had created an unfortunate misunderstanding. But I knew better. Oversight wasn't his sin. Arrogance was. That evening, I received a message through a secure server, an old co-worker from the company. He'd found something buried deep in the archives correspondence between my husband and an offshore firm signed under my name. Claire, he wrote, he's been using your identity to move funds for years. You need to protect yourself. I didn't respond immediately. I sat still watching the sunset bleed into the horizon through the window of my rented room. For years, I'd been a signature, a byline, a shadow behind his power. Now that same shadow was his undoing. It was never about revenge. It was about visibility, about forcing truth into the light without having to say a word. I thought back to the day he told me not to ask questions. It's complicated, he'd said. You wouldn't understand. He was wrong. I understood everything. I'd just been patient. By Wednesday, federal investigators had begun tracing the transactions. My name appeared in almost every document. I expected it. I wanted it. Because once they followed the trail far enough, they'd see where it really led to him. The last transaction on record was dated 3 years ago, the day he changed the company's internal authorization system. He'd left my credentials active, assuming I'd never notice. He never understood that invisibility is a dangerous gift. The journalist emailed again, asking for comment. I typed one sentence and sent it back. The truth doesn't need my voice, just time. That night, there was a knock at my door. For a moment, my chest tightened, but it wasn't him. It was a man in his 40s, familiar in a distant way. He introduced himself as Daniel, a former accountant from Bennett Holdings. You don't know me, he said, but I knew you were the one keeping that place from collapsing years ago. He explained how, after I left, the internal systems began failing one after another. He didn't just lose control, Daniel said softly. He never had it. He handed me a folder, hard copies of bank statements, encrypted logs, a printed list of accounts. This is what the USB unlocked, he added. I took it my hand steady. Inside were proofs, all the pieces of truth he'd built his empire on, each now labeled with his signature and mine. But there was one page I hadn't seen before, a document transferring ownership of key assets to me. He'd signed it himself 2 years earlier. I remembered that afternoon he'd been rushing to catch a flight, slid a stack of papers across the table, saying, "Just sign them, Claire." He hadn't read them. He never did. I looked up at Daniel. Does he know? He shook his head. Not yet, but he will. After he left, I spread the papers across the bed. My name appeared again and again, not as a shadow, but as an owner. Legally, Bennett Holdings, what was left of it, belonged to me. The next morning, the news reported that Richard Bennett had been removed as CEO, pending formal charges. The board cited gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. His photo appeared beneath the headline, "Shoulders Hunched, Eyes Empty." I poured myself coffee, steady and calm, and opened my notebook. Under a page titled Legacy, I wrote 3 sentences. He built his empire on my silence. I built my freedom on his paperwork. Fair trade. A call came through from an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering. His voice filled the line, hoarse, trembling. "Claire, please. I just need to understand." "What do you want from me?" I didn't answer right away. Outside rain began tapping the window. It sounded like punctuation, soft, deliberate. Finally, I said, "Nothing you have left." He was silent, then almost whispering, "You destroyed everything." "No," I said. I just stopped protecting it. The call ended. I stared at my reflection in the dark screen of the phone. I didn't look victorious. I looked alive. Later that night, I returned to the folder and placed it inside a lockbox. The USB went in next. I slid the box under the bed and turned off the light. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide. Justice, I realized, isn't always loud or public. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and signed in ink, years before anyone knows what it means. The indictment came faster than anyone expected. Fairfield had seen scandals before, but never one this clean, this surgical. The morning the charges hit the news, the street outside the Bennett house filled with cameras and satellite vans. His name, once synonymous with success, became shorthand for deceit. I didn't watch the press conference live. I listened to it on the radio while folding laundry, the mundane weight of the moment grounding me. The announcer read the charges: wire fraud, falsified tax documents, misuse of company funds. Then the words that made the air around me still under investigation, former CEO Richard Bennett. There it was, former. When I turned off the radio, the room stayed quiet for a long time. Not the kind of quiet that follows a storm, but the kind that follows understanding. He'd finally reached the end of the road he built for himself. They froze his accounts. His cars were impounded. Even the lake house, the one he'd bragged was untouchable, went under federal lien. But the real punishment wasn't the loss, it was exposure. For a man who lived off appearances, truth was a more merciless sentence than any prison cell. Reporters called me for weeks. I never spoke to them. My lawyer handled everything, insisting I'd had no involvement in his crimes. It wasn't hard to prove the paper trail told its own story. My name was everywhere, but my fingerprints were on nothing illegal. He'd used me as a cover, and in the end, that cover became his confession. He tried to contact me through intermediaries, mutual friends, his attorney, even his father's nurse. I ignored them all until one envelope arrived, handwritten, no return address. I recognized the penmanship immediately. The letter was short. Claire, they took everything. The house, the company, the respect. I don't even recognize myself anymore. You could end this. You could tell them it wasn't me. You know how much you meant to me, please. I read it twice, then folded it neatly back into the envelope and burned it over the sink. The paper curled like dried leaves, leaving behind a small pile of ash. That was all that was left of him in my life residue. Martha asked once if I felt vindicated. No, I said, just finished. Vindication implies anger. But I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud, closure is quiet, and quiet had always been my weapon. Some nights I still thought of him, not with love, not with hate, but with a detached curiosity, the way you think about an old photograph that no longer feels real. I wondered if he replayed that last sentence he ever said to me. Without me, you wouldn't last a single day. He'd been right about one thing. Someone couldn't last without the other. He just hadn't realized it wasn't me. One afternoon, I got a call from the federal investigator assigned to the case. Mrs. Bennett, he said, we've concluded the audit. You've been cleared of all involvement. Actually, his tone shifted slightly. You're listed as the primary beneficiary for several accounts, assets transferred legally before the investigation began. I thanked him, hung up, and sat there for a while, letting the words sink in. The empire he'd used to imprison me had become the inheritance that set me free. I didn't touch the money, not yet. Some things are meant to rest. Fairfield, of course, moved on quickly. New scandals replaced old ones. People stopped whispering when I passed through town. They nodded politely, unsure whether to pity or admire me. I gave them neither reason. One day, while visiting the cemetery where his father was buried, I saw him. He was thinner, older, moving slower. He didn't see me at first. I watched from a distance as he placed flowers on the grave, then stood there, head bowed. There was no entourage, no reporters, no tailored suit, just a man and his mistakes. He looked up and saw me then. For a long moment, we just stared across the distance, two ghosts haunting the same memory. Then he nodded once, a silent admission, maybe even an apology. I nodded back. That was enough. I turned to leave the wind carrying the faint sound of his voice. I didn't catch the words, and I didn't need to. Some things don't deserve to be heard twice. Back at the motel, I packed my things. Martha hugged me at the door. You sure you're ready to go? She asked. I've been ready for years, I said. As I loaded my suitcase into the trunk, I caught a glimpse of the USB still on the nightstand. I picked it up, turning it in my hand. It had started all of this, or maybe it had just revealed what was always there. I slipped it into my coat pocket. A reminder, not a trophy. When I drove out of Fairfield, the autumn leaves were beginning to fall again. The same road that once felt like escape now felt like return, not to a place, but to myself. The reckoning wasn't his arrest or his ruin. It was the realization that I had been whole all along. Autumn slipped quietly into winter, and with it came a stillness I hadn't felt in decades. No headlines, no phone calls, no ghosts, just the rhythm of ordinary life, the way it should have been all along. I moved into a small cottage near the coast of Maine, a place where mornings smell like salt and pine and the sea sounds like forgiveness. The town was modest, full of people who waved to strangers and didn't care who you used to be. That was exactly what I needed to live without being anyone's proof of success. Some nights the fog rolled in so thick that the world disappeared. I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, listening to the waves crash against the rocks, and I'd think about how easily one life can erase another, not through malice, but neglect. He hadn't destroyed me. He'd simply forgotten to see me. That's what power does. It blinds. But in the quiet of this new life, I began to notice all the small things that had been missing before: the tick of an old clock, the creak of a wooden floor, the sound of my own laughter echoing off the kitchen walls. I'd thought silence was emptiness. Now I understood it was space room to exist without fear of being diminished. Sometimes I still received letters from people who knew him. A former employee wrote, "I heard he's living in Florida now under another name. Lost most of his savings. No one wants to work with him." I didn't feel joy when I read that, only completion. The story had found its ending without my help. One afternoon, while unpacking boxes I'd left untouched since Fairfield, I found the USB again. Its surface was scratched, the label worn off. It looked ordinary, just a sliver of metal and plastic, but holding it I felt a weight far beyond its size. It wasn't about data or leverage anymore. It was a reminder I had once carried proof of a man's world, and now I carried proof of my own. I walked to the shoreline as the tide came in. The sun hung low, painting the water gold. I opened my hand, looked at the USB one last time, and let it fall into the surf. The sea swallowed it without hesitation. Some things belong to silence. That evening, Martha called from Connecticut. "You sound lighter," she said. "I am," I told her. I finally stopped listening for an apology that was never coming. She laughed softly. That's when you know it's really over. After we hung up, I sat in the dark and thought about all the women I'd met, the ones who stayed, the ones who left, the ones who were still deciding if they could. I wished I could tell each of them what I'd learned, that leaving isn't always about walking away. Sometimes it's about standing still until the noise dies down enough for you to hear your own voice again. There's a particular kind of peace that follows justice, not the kind handed down by courts, but the kind you grant yourself when you stop needing revenge to prove your worth. That's the peace I found here. On my morning walks, I pass the lighthouse at the edge of the cliff. It blinks its steady light across the water, guiding people I'll never meet. I like to think that's what healing is, not a flare of glory, but a steady glow that says I'm still here. Every story leaves echoes. Mine isn't about ruin. It's about recovery, about the strength hidden in restraint, about how sometimes the most powerful sound in the world is the one you never make. If you've listened this far, thank you. Maybe you know someone like him. Maybe you've been someone like me. If this story found you at the right time, share it. Tell someone who needs to hear it that quiet isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And if you ever forget, listen to the silence. It will remind you who you are